So you're going to hear me talk about the big picture of really working through phases 3, 4, and 5 as part of CTC. My expertise is definitely in the community level strategies, so the examples and the language I use are about strategies. The process is fundamentally the same for programs as well, but we'll just talk through each of these, how phase 3 and 4 and 5 feed into and build off of one another. So I've drawn all this, and we'll break down essentially all these different pieces throughout, but what we're talking about in this short video is really around the big picture of community assessment and action planning. How and why are we moving through phases 3, 4, and 5, and what are we building as a plan in our community? How does this feed off of each other? Okay, so we're assuming that your community is essentially coming up to the end of the CAW, the Community Assessment Workshop. And at the end of that, you would have prioritized risk and protective factors in your community. So I'm going to draw an example of how you build off of this risk or protective factor. I'll give you an example in here, and then show you essentially how that feeds all the way into the beginning of phase 5 in terms of all the action planning that you develop for your community before you really start implementation. All of this builds off of each other. So let's assume that your community prioritize access to substances as their risk factor in their community. That's at the end of the CAW. At the end of the CAW, you've prioritized the risk and protective factor. This is the example of access to substances. So as you move into the CRAW, the Community Resource Assessment, the first thing that you do is you use the menu of strategies the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has provided, and you say, what are the evidence-based strategies that could potentially adjust by risk factor? In this circumstance, they've identified 3. One is really around kind of policies, regulations, and ordinance related to retailers who sell or promote substances. One is related to conventional enforcement of existing policies, laws, ordinances, or regulations. So we'll put conventional enforcement here. And one is about utilizing statewide mass media resources to change social norms in your community. So you start essentially by assessing whether or not these things even exist in your community. So levels of different strategies here. So as you look at these initial evidence-based strategies that could potentially influence your risk factor in your community, the first question you ask is, what's going on related to this? Is it happening or is it not? So let's say that you decide that you already have all of those just different mass media materials that are being utilized in the state of Colorado in place. Your coalition at this stage could say, nope, not gonna do that one. Let's say that you feel like there's really great policies or regulations and ordinances in place related to retailers who sell substances in your community. You could also say, not gonna do this one. But you're like, we really think that we have some potential on working on conventional enforcement of these policies or ordinances. So you decide at this stage to move forward this strategy or multiple strategies to keep investigating whether or not your community could contribute to that work. So what you do next is you essentially try to identify whether or not your community has capacity to support doing work around this. We break this down into 10 different capacity areas that fit into 3 buckets primarily. So one is enhance your community's capacity to do this. This is where you want to make sure that you have administration and operations in place, funding in place, a shared understanding of the work in place, and a couple different areas that you'll walk through. You then want to kind of push this out. All right, we've got our house in order. Let's push this out to make sure that we have real community support for it. So you'll want to build public support. This is where you want to make sure that there's leadership in place, that the community supports this work, that you're giving outreach and education to community members. The final and really critical piece of this is improve So this is the piece where you want to make sure that you're evaluating and monitor and improving your work over time, that you're actually doing those best practices in the work that you do. So you'll have an assessment that essentially tells you how strong or potentially weak areas that you can improve are in terms of capacity to do this specific strategy. These pieces play a really integral piece as you move into phases 4 and 5. So that's really what happens, the big picture in the crawl. So as you make decisions about which strategies you want to move forward, there'll be guidance around which ones you decide to push to your community, but your work group will take over a few of those strategies to decide in the community planning workshop, now in phase 4. So essentially, phase 4, the first part of that is really around discuss, debate, and decide which community level strategies you're going to put into your action plan. After you decide what you're going to do, what you do is you actually set outcome goals. So what you're doing is setting the big picture of what you want to achieve in your community. Don't forget why we're doing this work that we're doing, right? So you set outcomes for 2 different pieces. The risk or protective factor. So you go back to what you prioritized again, and you say, this is what I want to see change in my community related to my risk or protective factor. You also set one related to the strategy or implementation outcome, is what it's called, where you say, as a result of deciding or working on this strategy, this is what we want to see in our community. So you go back, what do you want to do first? So after you've decided what you're going to work on, you actually organically move into, now that we know what we want to achieve, how are we going to achieve it? What happens in here is that people don't tend to notice that that's all been part of the community planning workshop in phase 4, but all of a sudden you get to phase 5. So this development of the kind of action planning of what you'll do in the community is actually still part of phase 5, but it's still a planning piece of what you do. There are 3 pieces of the how that you'll build out before you really start to implement, and they all feed off of all of the great work you've done so far. The first one, and most obvious, is that you're going to build out implementation plans, which is really around activities, who's responsible, so the stakeholders in the community. We'll go through this at another point, but essentially we'll call this the RACI decision making that you'll make of who's responsible for what and who is accountable, consulted, and informed in that process. Also, how you'll get youth involved, and a timeline for your work. The important piece of the activities is that they directly are built off of what areas you needed to do to build capacity in your community. So doing this work up front really helps you identify very specific activities tailored to your community that'll help you do local level work really well. So that's an important piece of the feedback loop in here as well. Once you've built the implementation plan, next step is evaluation, right? So you're going to build your evaluation plan from there. That's just where you'll actually develop out instruments or kind of the tool that will house the information you collect and an indicator that tells you about the success. You'll also build out a monitoring plan for your work over time as part of this. The last piece of phase 5 is funding. You want to make sure that you can tap into diverse resources over time. So you'll actually pull your work group together and work on this as well to make sure that you can sustain your efforts over time. both financial and even part of human resources, right? You want to think about those pieces as well in there. From there, what you have, after you get approval and we kind of look over these different pieces, is the ability to go. That's where you really get to do that work in the community. And I would be remiss not to say that the other piece that you always want to be thinking about is this monitoring and improving over time. We want to make sure we're reflecting on the work we do and doing really great work over time. So the great thing about monitoring, improving, and reflecting on your work over time is that it allows you to step back and take the big picture, look at all this, and really saying, are we really achieving what we wanted to achieve? So what great question as to why we're doing all of these really intense assessment and planning pieces. Two big points to make around this. One is that you are fundamentally setting yourself up for success. The reasoning behind this is really that you now have a very intimate level of knowledge of what is and isn't happening in your community, where there are capacity areas that could be improved. So by the time you get to the point where you're saying we want to improve this work in our community, you've really built up this is exactly what we need to do and how we're going to do it. It's very convincing for leadership in your community. The other piece as part of this, and as part of CTC in general, is that this whole process really serves to just build community buy-in to the work that you're doing, right? All of these different coalition members have been involved in this process and are saying, yes, let's go forward on this. I'm bought in, I want to move this forward. And I really think these two pieces together are really what help sustain the work in the community over time. Without people advocating for it and with having a really solid plan in place to move these things forward, this is why this is so important. So now what? What steps do you take after knowing this big picture, right? So one is, as we have always said, follow the milestones and benchmarks. The reason we keep stating this is because that is fidelity to the CTC model. You should work through the process they've outlined. That's what they've tested. That's what we know really works to make true community change. The interesting piece of this is that we have tools available to help you through this process, but they can be tailored, they can be not utilized, they can be adapted just for whatever use you need. The goal is fundamentally to just get through the process and make sure that you're having adherence to that milestone. Did you understand what's happening in your community? Do you understand the capacity needs in it? How you do that is something that you can work with your coach and other support teams on, exactly. And the final piece I would add in here, as you're going through that whole big process, is build your community. Don't forget that phases 1 and 2 are a critical part of the work that you're doing. You're starting to specify and to really understand what action you'll be taking in your community as part of phases 3, 4, and 5. So you want to make sure that you're building the right community members to really support that work and to get them engaged. You want them to truly be responsible, own, and drive this work in your community.